What I want to do now is to begin a new project, something that I'm calling the Oswald Spengler Project, where I'm going to take another look at Decline of the West in detail, only this time I'm actually going to be crazy enough to read through it line by line and give a commentary on every single line. And not only that, but I also, since not that many of Spengler's books have been translated into English to begin with, I also want to read through those as well. He wrote Decline of the West, Volume 1 in 1918. Volume 2 came out, I think, in 1924, if I'm not mistaken, 22 or 24. And then Prussianism and Socialism was a book of essays that came out in between those two. And then a little book on technology, one of the first books ever written on technology, actually, Man and Technics, in the mid-1930s, which was followed by his last book, The Hour of Decision, and then he dies in 1936. He was born in 1880, dies in 1936, spent most of his life living in Munich, which he regarded as, it's significant that he lived in Munich, not Berlin, since, as we'll see, he creates this idea of certain types of cities which are culturally fostering. Small provincial places like Munich produce culture, like Goethe's Weimar is another example, as opposed to giant, soulless, megalopolitan cities, which are cosmopolitan, decadent, degenerate places of corruption and vice, like Berlin, or Paris, or London, or New York. He regarded those places with horror as places of megalopolitan degeneracy, as indeed they are. And so, what I want to do here, then, this is my volume of Decline of the West, which we'll be reading. I've had it since college, and it needs some repair work. It's kind of falling apart here. So, moving right into this, then, what I want to do is, this is the classic translation by Charles Francis Atkinson, and it's unabridged, so we're reading the unabridged version. This will take forever, and if I manage to complete it, that might be a couple of hundred videos here. Volume 1 is called Form and Actuality. This is very important, form and actuality. This is a tradition that goes all the way back to Aristotle with this idea of analogies, where Aristotle takes Plato's ideas, which are transcendent forms, and he incarnates them within as little metaphysical soul units that are incarnated in entities. Everything that lives has an analogy that has a telos or a goal that it's trying to get to. The telos of the acorn is, of course, the tree. So form and actuality, the form is the analogy itself that is morphologically grounded and that is transforming the entity through time, through the process of actualizing all of its possibilities. The form, whatever it is that comes into being, is pregnant with a certain number of metaphysical possibilities that need to be actualized over time. So the actualization process consists in manifesting those possibilities and making them actual within the realm of space and time. So this is the morphological tradition, and this is absolutely crucial to understand what Spengler's doing here. You can't get anywhere with Spengler without understanding this idea of morphology and this idea that history has a morphology. Goethe coined the term morphology, and here in one of the prefaces he thanks Goethe as one of his primary influences. Morphology is the word he coined, and it means the study of forms, but it has a special connotation. These are not dead forms. With the Germans and the German scientific and philosophical tradition, morphology refers to living forms, basically analogies, very much like Aristotle's analogies, living forms. Civilization for Spengler consists of 9 giant civilizations, each with a predetermined 1,000-year lifespan that is alive, morphologically pregnant with metaphysical possibilities that it actualizes out of the abyss of the nothing into the light of day. And there's only a certain number of them. That's the thing. The possibilities that can be actualized morphologically within a civilization are predetermined to a set number. Once those possibilities are actualized and the civilization has completely fulfilled itself, it essentially enters a phase of death, even though it may be a living death, as is the case with cultures that are still surviving, like China and India, that have long since gone through their morphological phase phases of actualization, they can become these sort of petrified giants that live in a state of suspended decrepitude. Nothing new is going to come out of India or China as far as new cultural forms that shape the civilization go. That's dead, done, and gone. So that's this concept of morphology is extremely important to grasp this. And let's see, he's got a quote from Goethe. Let's see, let's see, I've got it translated here on back here. So when you open it, the Goethe quote, where is it? The Goethe quote that he quotes is translated into English, which I'm sure is extremely clumsy compared to the original. In the endless self-repeating flows forevermore the same, myriad arches, springing, meeting, hold at rest the mighty frame. Streams from all things love of living, grandest star and humblest clod. All the straining, all the striving is eternal peace in God. So he wants you to have this idea in your head of Goethe's worldview that the world is a living place. These are not dead forms as they are for mathematicians. For mathematicians and that type of scientist, the Newton type of scientist, where the world is made up of these dead laws, because the laws are immutable. They're unchangeable, these men pretend. They're unchangeable, they're immutable. They don't change and grow with the universe. They may as well be inscribed in stone, and so they're dead in a certain sense. So let's read the preface to the first edition, which he says was finished as the Great War was coming to an end, which extends from 1914 to 1918, and it was coming to an end, but in 1917, the preface dates from 1917, Volume 1 came out in 1918, just as the war was ending. And he says, the complete manuscript of this book, the outcome of 3 years' work, was ready when the Great War broke out. So it took him 3 years to write this, from 1914 rather, to 1917. By the spring of 1917, it had been worked over again, and in certain details supplemented and cleared up, but its appearance in print was still delayed by the conditions then prevailing. Although a philosophy of history is its scope and subject, it possesses also a certain deeper significance as a commentary on the great epochal moment of which the portents were visible when the leading ideas were being formed. The title, which had been decided upon in 1912, and I think it's interesting that he came up with the title for the book, which in German is Der Untergang des Abendlandes, Twilight of the Evening Lands. That title really, it doesn't come through in the English, Decline of the West, really wants you to think of a sunset. The evening lands are the west, where the sun is setting in the west. So he wants you to think of a sunset. But I also think it's interesting that the title occurred to him in 1912, the year of the sinking of the Titanic, which I always think of, which I wrote about in my book, The Age of Catastrophe, as a perfect parable of the state of Western civilization. It's already hit the iceberg. It's clashed with the environment, with nature, and it's only going to, it's just as the Titanic had exactly 2 hours mathematically calculated to sink. Once it hit that iceberg, our civilization has 5 centuries, pretty much as its final death knell as the global sea waters rise. So I think it's interesting that he came up with the title in 1912. He says it expresses quite literally the intention of the book, which was to describe, in the light of the decline of the classical age, one world historical phase of several centuries upon which we ourselves are now entering. Events have justified much and refuted nothing. It became clear that these ideas must necessarily be brought forward at just this moment and in Germany, and more that the war itself was an element in the premises from which the new world picture could be made precise. For I am convinced that it is not merely a question of writing one out of several possible and merely logically justifiable philosophies, but of writing the philosophy of our time. So this is a rather humble man. One that is to some extent a natural philosophy and is dimly presaged by all. This may be said without presumption for an idea that is historically essential, that does not occur within an epoch, but itself makes that epoch, is only in a limited sense the property of him to whose lot it falls to present it. It belongs to our time as a whole and influences all thinkers without their knowing it. It is but the accidental, private attitude towards it, without which no philosophy can exist, that, with its faults and its merits, is the destiny and the happiness of the individual. Oswald Spengler, Munich, December 1917. All right, so that's his little preface. We'll skip the second preface, which he wrote in 1922, to the revised edition, because I want to stick to all this chronologically. So we'll read that when we finish the first and get to the second, where it comes out in between the two of them. I do want to note one thing from it. That other preface is his thinking of his two biggest influences, Goethe and Nietzsche. And I would say that if you boiled it down to two texts that are the absolute texts that influence Decline of the West like nothing else, and if you deleted those two texts from existence as though they had never been, this book would not exist. They would be Goethe's essay on the metamorphosis of plants, from which all the life cycle morphological stuff comes, and Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, where he examines the disintegrative effects of the Socratic man who comes on stage and sterilizes culture forms by questioning them and questioning them and questioning them until the culture becomes sterilized and starts to shift away from spirituality and metaphysics into a purely rational, empty worldview. That's in Birth of Tragedy, and in a certain way, Spengler takes those two texts and combines them. So they're absolutely crucial to read to understand this. So moving on then into Chapter 1, the introduction, Spengler says, "In this book is attempted for the first time the venture of predetermining history, of following the still untraveled stages in the destiny of a culture, and specifically of the only culture of our time and on our planet, which is actually in the phase of fulfillment, the West European American, that is to say the Faustian civilization. It's the only one still in its phases of fulfillment, although it's entering into its twilight, and it's shifting from what he calls culture to civilization, but it's still got a ways to go, a few centuries. My prediction with the global warming pretty much matches the timeline that he gives in the back of the book for how much is left, about 5 centuries worth of sort of post-cultural cultural forms, like all the series of the Roman emperors. That goes on and on for quite a while. And so all the other cultures, and he identifies 9 of them, are dead. They're morphologically exhausted. They're in a state of thermodynamic exhaustion, no maximum entropy, with the exception of Russia. Russia is the only culture, according to Spengler, that is nascent. It's newborn. It has been stuck and atrophied for a bit because of a Western pseudomorphosis that has influenced it and disrupted its development for a while, but it's in the process of shedding that, and he sees the future as belonging to Russia, as did Rudolf Steiner, not coincidentally, who lived about the same time as Spengler. Steiner's my all-time favorite mystic. Steiner also has an essay on Spengler, a little book, very short. I don't remember it being terribly good, but he does have that for anyone who wants to read it. Hitherto, the possibility of solving a problem so far-reaching has evidently never been envisaged, and even if it had been so, the means of dealing with it were either altogether unsuspected or, at best, inadequately used. Is there a logic of history? Is there, beyond all the causal and incalculable elements of the separate events, something that we may call a metaphysical structure of historic humanity, something that is essentially independent of the outward forms, social, spiritual, and political, which we see so clearly? Are not these actualities indeed secondary or derived from that something? Does world history present to the seeing eye certain grand traits again and again, with sufficient constancy to justify certain conclusions? And if so, what are the limits to which reasoning from such premises may be pushed? So he's talking about the forms that are not visible to our eyes are the invisible forms that are shaping the culture. What I call archai, he's calling forms in the Goethean sense, the invisible entelechy that are structuring the life cycles of each of these civilizations. Is it possible to find in life itself for human history is the sum of mighty life courses which already have had to be endowed with ego and personality and customary thought and expression by predicating entities of a higher order like the classical or the Chinese culture, modern civilization, a series of stages which must be traversed, and traversed moreover in an ordered and obligatory sequence. There are certain ways he has of dividing these stages that each civilization goes through, and they all go through the same four basic stages, which is a pre-cultural stage. That's an early stage as the culture is nascent and just being born, and in which Russia is at today. Then the cultural stage, or let's say early cultural, but cultural proper now, not pre-cultural. So pre-cultural, early cultural, the late culture, which is the twilight of all the grand metaphysical forms. That happened in the West around the year 1800 for us. And then finally, the last phase, which is civilization. And by culture, he means the living, metaphysically endowed and driven stage of the civilization, where the primary concerns are art, metaphysics, and spirituality. In the civilization phase, on the other hand, which is the last of these four phases, the primary driving forces are depressingly banal: economics, politics, money, all this pragmatic crap that I have had no interest in whatsoever. Culture is about that, culture. It's not about bread and circuses for the masses. That's not what it is. For everything organic, the notions of birth, death, youth, age, lifetime are fundamentals. May not these notions in this sphere also possess a rigorous meaning which no one has as yet extracted? In short, is all history founded upon general biographic archetypes? And there's the archai that I've been talking about, which for me, in my work, the archai are not archetypes. We can shove the Jungian archetypes out of the way. They've had their day. They're dead, done, and gone. I think we don't need Jungian archetypes anymore. The archai, rather, are cultural forms and biological forms simultaneously that underlie both biological forms as they go through the 15 or so geological epochs that we have had, going from the Hadean and the Archean all the way down to where we're at today. And then there are also archai, which are the primary metaphysical structuring forces that come into being at the birth of a civilization. And make no mistake about it, religion is the primary creative force. This is something people like Sam Harris get dead wrong. Religion is the primary creative force. In a way, it's almost the only thing that matters as far as human culture goes, because without it, everything else crumbles. You could put religion, imagine it as a pyramid, which I hate to do because it's a kind of silly Ken Wilberian thing to think of, but it is a fact that if religion is at the bottom of that pyramid and you delete it, the whole rest of the edifice of culture comes crashing down. Religion is what brings civilization into being. Without religion, you can't even have a civilization. It just doesn't exist. So all you atheists out there, you're looking at the world from a dead point of view that has no influence on culture forms whatsoever. All the culture forms begin with religious, usually with new death cults. I've studied this extensively in my Evolution of the Afterlife video series that I have on YouTube. That each one, and Spengler says this in here, each one of these 9 civilizations comes into being with a new religion and a new death cult, a new way of disposal of the dead. The Egyptians come into being with their religion and mummification. That's a totally new way of disposing of the dead that has its own metaphysical significance that's different from, let's say, the Hindu cult, the Vedic cult of the dead, which is based on burning the dead. That has a different significance. Although the Greeks come into being with 2 forms, actually. At first with the Mycenaeans and their tholoi structure. They have the internment of the dead into a hero cult with a structure, a dome-shaped structure. But then when the Dorians come, they get rid of all that Mycenaean method of disposing of the dead and bring in burning of the dead, just like in Vedic India. So there are new methods of disposing of the dead, because all of that is intensely connected with a whole new world view, what Heidegger would call an Ereignis event. And I regard Heidegger very highly as probably the second, my second most favorite philosopher after Spengler. I think those two men understood culture better than pretty much anyone ever did. So yeah, Heidegger's got this idea of an Ereignis event. He's also, Heidegger, as we'll see when we get to it, he's also got the idea of separate world ages, although he sort of inherits the very model that Spengler is destroying here of ancient, medieval, modern, which Spengler regards as Ptolemaic because everything revolves around the West in that model, to the Copernican model where all the civilizations are their own center, revolving around a kind of sun of metaphysics, I suppose you could say, but each one has its own center with its own life cycle. But Heidegger, even though he read Spengler, read him early on, he read Decline of the West not too long after it came out, liked it very much, still clung for some reason to the ancient medieval modern schema, but he did some interesting things with it. All right, so where are we at here? The decline of the West, which at first sight may appear like the corresponding decline of the classical culture, a phenomenon limited in time and space, we now perceive to be a philosophical problem that, when comprehended in all its gravity, includes within itself every great question of being. So he's already got the word sein here, the word being, which will have different connotations for both Spengler and Heidegger. Spengler will also use the word Dasein, as we'll see, with a totally different meaning from Heidegger's Dasein. If, therefore, we are to discover in what form the destiny of the Western culture will be accomplished, we must first be clear as to what culture is, what its relations are to visible history, to life, to soul, to nature, to intellect, what the forms of its manifestation are, and how far these forms, peoples, tongues, and epochs, battles and ideas, states and gods, arts and craftworks, sciences, laws, economic types and world ideas, great men and great events may be accepted and pointed to as symbols. Everything becomes symbolic for Spengler if it's symbol-worthy, if it's genuinely metaphysic. Everything refers to something metaphysical and inward. He's got this emphasis on inward necessity. He's inherited this idea of necessity from the German philosophical tradition that starts with Kant, where for Kant, necessity is what guarantees causality, that it's always going to be the case, that if A happens, then B follows, because necessity is the thing that makes it universally true. Here, for Spengler, necessity means a different thing. Kant, he would regard, and we'll see this distinction here in the very next paragraph, Kant he will regard as one of the men of the priesthood of science who look at nature in a dead way, not a living way. It doesn't necessarily mean, when he puts it that way, to denigrate these men, because they are, after all, grand metaphysicians. Kant, Newton, Galileo, they're also metaphysicians. But they're creating a different thing, a different kind of world picture from what the artist does, or the thinker like Leonardo or Goethe, who perceives the world as a living entity that's undergoing transformations, morphological transformations over time. Okay, so he says here, that's subsection 1. Subsection 2 goes, the means whereby to identify dead forms is mathematical law. The means whereby to understand living forms is analogy. By these means, we are enabled to distinguish polarity and periodicity in the world. This is an extremely important, very short paragraph. It's a transformation of a line from Goethe here, which I've written down in the beginning of my copy of Decline of the West. When Goethe said, the Godhead is effective in the living and the becoming, and not in the become and the set fast. The understanding is concerned to make use of the become. Reason is concerned to make use of the becoming. So he's basically taken that statement almost verbatim and transformed it into this distinction between dead forms and mathematical law, living forms and analogy. So what Goethe means here by the distinction between the understanding and reason. The understanding is concerned to make use of the become, dead things. Verstand is the word here. And Verstand can be pictured as the Kantian categories, the a priori categories of the understanding, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, with each one of them having three subcategories, of which causality is the most important of all of them, which makes sense for a scientific object, makes sense out of it, sort of plugs it into what Heidegger would call Vorhandenheit, or a self-sufficiency of being that's a metaphysical phase space divorced from the historical world of becoming and transformation. Verstand makes use of dead forms, according to Goethe, and Goethe read Kant, whereas reason, Vernunft, reason makes use of living forms. Vernunft for Kant was concerned with the metaphysical ideas, the great ideas, God, freedom, immortality, all the great metaphysical ideas, as far as he was concerned. So that was his distinction between reason and the understanding. The understanding is concerned with applying categories to the world. Reason is concerned with looking at the world from a transcendent metaphysical perspective and synthesizing a gigantic world picture out of it, what Spengler will call world as nature, as we'll see. And then so he takes that statement from Goethe and he transforms it into mathematical law, which then becomes associated with Verstand, mathematical law, thinking of Goethe's, or rather Kant's categories, and analogy. And by analogy now, you could almost say this is the difference between Kant and Goethe, or let's say between even Newton and Goethe, and the way that they looked at the world. Analogy, again, goes back to morphology, whereby you identify morphological equivalencies between animal forms, and this was a big sort of metaphysical biological science that was going on in Goethe's day. That was popular with the French too as well, people like Lamarck and Cuvier and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, where you say the lungs of a human being are morphologically analogous, or let's say morphologically homologous to the swim bladder of a fish, whereas the lungs of a human being are analogous to the gills. They perform the same function, whereas the swim bladder and the lungs are the same organ, simply transformed differently because of their being immersed in different world environments, different world rounds. So that's what he means by analogy. He means both analogy and homology together. That's how you identify these. What they were trying to find was the animal, as Goethe found the plant, by identifying all the distinct phases that plants go through in their life cycle as they go through transformation after transformation. And you can sort of abstract the Platonic Pflanze out of all that, and now you've got an analogical, morphological, homological study of forms so that you can see what the hidden metaphysical interior is behind the things that are being exteriorized into the world of light and day. And then so it is and has always been a matter of knowledge that the expression forms of world history are limited in number, and that eras, epochs, situations, persons are ever repeating themselves true to time. Napoleon has hardly ever been discussed without a side glance at Caesar and Alexander, analogies of which, as we shall see, the first is morphologically quite unacceptable, and the second is correct. The analogy between Napoleon and Alexander, they are morphologically analogous, but not Caesar. Caesar is a different thing. The Western Caesar has yet to appear, actually. While Napoleon himself conceived of his situation as akin to Charlemagne's, the French Revolutionary Convention spoke of Carthage when it meant England, and the Jacobins styled themselves Romans. Other such comparisons of all degrees of soundness and unsoundness are those of Florence with Athens, Buddha with Christ, primitive Christianity with modern socialism, the Roman financial magnate of Caesar's time with the Yankee, Petrarch, the first passionate archaeologist. And is not archaeology itself an expression of the sense that history is repetition? Related himself mentally to Cicero, and but lately Cecil Rhodes, the organizer of British South Africa, who had in his library specially prepared translations of the classical lives of the Caesars, felt himself akin to the Emperor Hadrian. The fate of Charles XII of Sweden used to carry Quintus Curtius's Life of Alexander in his pocket, and to copy that conqueror was his deliberate purpose. So men have always made comparisons. Alexander used to carry a copy of the Iliad with him wherever he went, constantly comparing himself to Achilles, like that, in that same tradition. But Spengler will say that these comparisons are mostly superficial, and they're not getting the morphological angle correct. Like comparing Napoleon with Alexander, these two appear in their cultures at the respective point when culture is breaking down and shifting into civilization and shifting into from an intensive mode to an extensive mode of world conquest to try to form an empire. So they are morphologically correctly analogous. Most of these are not. Frederick the Great, in his political writings, such as his Considerations, 1738, moves among analogies with perfect assurance. Thus he compares the French to the Macedonians under Philip and the Germans to the Greeks. Even now, he says, the Thermopylae of Germany, Alsace, and Lorraine are in the hands of Philip. Therein exactly characterizing the policy of Cardinal Fleury. We find him drawing parallels also between the policies of the houses of Habsburg and Bourbon and the proscriptions of Antony and of Octavius. Still, all this was only fragmentary and arbitrary, and usually implied rather a momentary inclination to poetical or ingenious expressions than a really deep sense of historical forms. This is the case of Ranke, a master of artistic analogy. We find that his parallels of Cyaxares and Henry the Fowler, the inroads of the Cimmerians and those of the Hungarians, possess morphologically no significance, and his oft-quoted analogy between the Hellenic city-states and the Renaissance republics very little, while the deeper truth in his comparison of Alcibiades and Napoleon is accidental. Unlike the strict mathematician who finds interrelationships between two groups of differential equations, where the layman sees nothing but dissimilarities of outward form, Ranke and others draw their historical analogies with a Plutarchian, popular romantic touch, and aim merely at presenting comparable scenes on the world stage. It is easy to see that, at bottom, it is neither a principle nor a sense of historic necessity, but simple inclination that governs the choice of the tableau. From any technique of analogies, we are far distant. They throng up, today more than ever, without scheme or unities, and if they do hit upon something which is true, in the essential sense of the word that remains to be determined, it is thanks to luck, more rarely to instinct, never to a principle. In this region, no one hitherto has set himself to work out a method, nor has had the slightest inkling that there is here a root, in fact the only root, from which can come a broad solution to the problems of history. So Spengler is trying very hard here to make it sound like his work is a total innovation, which it is. There's nothing been like it in history. And in that sense, he belongs in the tradition of the greats like Milton, whose opening lines in Paradise Lost talk about how he's the first to do things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. There's a whole tradition of Western thinkers saying, I'm the first to do this. And that's part of the Western sense of ego, the Western sense of the uniqueness of the individual ego. We like to sign our names, our signatures in the West. Analogies, insofar as they laid bare the organic structure of history, might be a blessing in historical thought. Their technique, developing under the influence of a comprehensive idea, would surely eventuate in inevitable conclusions and logical mastery, but as hitherto understood and practiced, they have been a curse, for they have enabled the historians to follow their own tastes, instead of soberly realizing that their first and hardest task was concerned with the symbolism of history and its analogies, and in consequence the problem has till now not even been comprehended, let alone solved. Superficial in many cases, as for instance in designating Caesar as the creator of the official newspaper, these analogies are worse than superficial in others, as when phenomena of the classical age that are not only extremely complex, but utterly alien to us, are labeled with modern catchwords like socialism, impressionism, capitalism, clericalism, while occasionally they are bizarre to the point of perversity. Witness the Jacobin clubs with their cult of Brutus, that millionaire extortioner Brutus who, in the name of oligarchical doctrine and with the approval of the patrician Senate, murdered the man of the democracy. So I guess we'll stop there for the first video. We're going a bit long here for YouTube attention span. But he's setting up the problem here, and the first dichotomy to get is this distinction between mathematical law, which is going to transform later into the world as nature, cosmologically speaking. It's a dead set of immutable laws, versus analogy, which is living, and which he will say transforms into the world as history, which has to do with internal morphological becomings, things that are alive, becoming, and transforming, and that requires what we'll call physiognomic tact, a kind of handling of things to feel the pulse of their livingness versus the systematic, the world as nature picture that is produced by the priesthood of science, that is governed by mathematical law, is a realm of exactitude and absolutely immutable laws. Okay, so we'll stop there for our first video on the Oswald Spengler project.